Jonathan, thank you for being with us. I was hoping we could start by talking about the themes that are behind this year's programme. You're commemorating the anniversary of the First World War and also the Commonwealth Games that are happening in Glasgow this summer. I wonder how those themes have influenced your programming of this festival.
Well, actually, it's slightly broader than that. Certainly the anniversary and the close coincidence of the starting of that horrific war on the 4th of August 1914 and the start of the festival season in Edinburgh was a coincidence that we had to acknowledge. Certainly the presence of a lot of Commonwealth countries in Glasgow in the immediately prior to the festival is something we want to acknowledge. But for me it was even more important than that. It was a festival that starts its life in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, needs to acknowledge the relationship that artists have created between war and peace, how culture reconciles conflict in the broadest sense, and how artists have been doing that, not just for a century, not several centuries, but for thousands of years, and not just in Europe, but beyond Europe, how the whole notion of what one of the main purposes of art is to actually build an alternative view of human potential to fighting and conflict, to actually suggest that there are better angels of our souls, and also to suggest that artists, when they are thinking about ways of commemorating, ways of marking, of acknowledging these moments, they aren't mired in doom and gloom. They're actually often at their most transcendent and sublime. So there's something quite ethereal that happens at the moments that are most dark.
Something that's coming across is that a lot of the works in the programme are reflections on the impact of decision making, whether it's collective decision making, whether it's the decisions that have been made by those in power on behalf of those who don't have power. And something that is obviously very important to Scotland this year is the referendum that's happening mere weeks after the end of the festival. And I wonder how much you feel that the issues of nationhood, of cultural identity, of collective experience is content that is relevant to that referendum.
I think it's very relevant, but it's not specifically relevant, is what I'd say. I think it would be wrong for an international festival to respond very directly to something that is essentially a political question. We're not seeking election, we're not seeking a mandate, and we don't have a specific manifesto. What I think, however, we can do is we can suggest that here are the ways in which artists over thousands of years have sought to assert their own identity, have thought deeply about the political issues that surrounded them, and who have thought how to acknowledge and make special and create a symbolism around some of these things, whether it's very direct or it's very symbolic. And I think everywhere you look in the programme, that atmosphere of identity, personal responsibility and identity is prevalent and powerfully positioned, I would suggest.
So Jonathan, you identify primarily as a composer, you also studied architecture. I wonder how these two elements of your past combine in your role as festival director.
Well, that's exactly how they combine as a festival director. Because as a festival director, you are somebody who is a servant of and hopefully experienced with or in the realm of the arts. And as a composer, I have at least a little claim to do that. Whether my work's good or not, I've actually done it. I've faced that blank page. I've faced some doubts. I've been frustrated, like all artists are. But as an architect, as a person who studied architecture, I'm very interested in space, whether it's public space, whether it's public infrastructure, whether it's auditoriums, or whether it's cities and urban spaces. And for me, those two fascinations converge in that great animation of the city or the town that is the festival. Because for me, a festival is not just 100 individual performances. A festival is a performance in a city. The Edinburgh Festival is a performance of the city of Edinburgh as much as individual performances in the city. The city is a partner. The city is a character. The city is part of the performance. And so every nook and cranny, every specific building, the tone, the light, the history of Edinburgh is taken into account when people come here. When I'm thinking about a program for a festival, there's a quote from a wonderful French philosopher called Maurice Merleau-Ponty. I always keep this in the back of my mind, and he says, just as places are sensed, senses are placed. And for me, the festival experience is finding a way through that reciprocity of really understanding the essence of the place you're in, and then placing your senses, whether you're a musician through sound, whether you are a playwright through many different dimensions, but words and the visuals, whether you are a dancer through things like bodies in space, placing all of that onto the canvas of the unique canvas of a city, a very unique canvas in the case of Edinburgh.
And this is your 8th and indeed your final festival as director here in Edinburgh. Would it be fair to say that this particular programme has a lot of you in it?
I think all of the festivals have had a lot of me in them. There is, of course, one project this year that is very personal to me, and it's something that I have to admit I questioned myself about, which was whether or not I would include a work of my own. It wasn't my idea, actually. I had been asked by a number of people in Edinburgh who were genuinely curious about what my work is like. Okay, you're a composer, so let's hear something. You haven't overdone it, you haven't commissioned yourself, you haven't put yourself forward in every year. So there's probably in your last festival, it's a nice idea. So on the very last night of the festival at the Usher Hall, very last concert at the Usher Hall this year, we're having a wonderful program in which a piece of mine is accompanied by a piece of Janacek. The piece of Janacek is the Glagolitic Mass. Fantastic piece of music. And my piece is called Sandakan Threnody. And it's not a biography about a horrible event, although the event was horrible, but it's a lament. It's a kind of putting to rest the souls of people that I never knew, but my father was in that prison camp in North Borneo. As I say, my piece is a sort of oratorio in 3 movements. It's not actually a critique of the Japanese. It's much more personal. It's a statement of lament, of solidarity, of sadness, but of optimism as well for those troops and their plight. And it's also, in the truest sense of the Greek meaning of the word threnody, threnos, grieving, it has to be a public act. You can't shove things under the carpet. And we see that with great relevance today, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Syria. We need to bear witness. We need to have the voices who have been silenced able to be heard. We need these collective memories to be in some way respected and captured. And so this was a moment of deep personal emotion for me, to be able to say, before my father died, that I was offering to all of the people with whom he had suffered, that there was somebody who was taking that circumstance forward and simply using my skills, whether they were good or not is irrelevant, the things that I had learnt in my life were at his disposal or at the disposal of this particular moment.
An extraordinarily personal and yet also urgent and universal close to the festival.
Sadly, these things are persistent and they're recurring. And I would say to people who are at any age, whether they've experienced war or whether, fortunately, they're like us, they're from a generation that hasn't, we shouldn't forget, and we mustn't forget, and we forget at our peril, and that kind of cultural amnesia is what perpetrates further bloodshed and horrors. So not all of this is simple, not all of this is easy, but all of it, I hope, gives us an enlarged and enriched sense of our humanity.